Now we're going to discuss the Golden Age of Greece. This is probably the one that we know the most about, both in our studies from history as well as theater history and whatnot. This is the classical period that we're going to specifically talk about the Ionic order of architecture. Again, the Ionic exists in all three periods, but it becomes extremely popular during this period as well as the Ionic style of dress. It's the more simple dress of the Doric. So first of all, the Golden Age, we know that there's Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, who pondered the nature of the universe, the meaning of life, and ethical values. Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides wrote dramas for the public dealing with the nature and fate of man. The idea even of history as a literary form which related and analyzed past experiences was born. There were three real ideals that would lead to harmony in the Greek sense. The first is humanisms, that humans are at the center of everything, and this is why we see gods very specifically in human form, represented over and over and over again. The pantheon, specifically looking to seeing this gigantic form of Athena that we've seen already, but this Athena especially, Athens reigning supreme as the most enlightened city. Really, Athena tends to come to the forefront. The next ideal is idealism itself, being that mankind should be perfect and beautiful. And therefore people should strive to make themselves look more attractive as well as have use their minds. So therefore people were, specifically men, were supposed to go to the gymnasium, work out, play sports, be sound in mind, body, and spirit. And so the idealism really was the balance between the real world and the ideal world. The fact that we can't ever truly get to our ideal, but we should always be striving for that. And finally, there was rationalism, which was used to attain balance between chaos and order, the attainable and the unattainable. Essentially, these values really shaped Greek culture. It was also the idea that people wanted to imitate and yet slightly abstract nature. I think this also comes out of the Minoan frescoes that I showed you earlier. And so we start to see bits of nature reproduced in marble, in certain kinds of architectural details that become almost taken for granted as a symbol later. Greek settlements continued to expand, and they also borrowed from costumes that they came into contact with. So there was real cultural exchange between the cultures in the Mediterranean, and so there would be things that would be taken by, say, the Persians from the Greeks, and then the Greeks would also take some things from the Persians, and so on and so forth, even though at times they were at war. So essentially, the Greeks were building in marble, architectural masterpieces. Most people lived in ordinary and unpretentious mud brick houses without any kind of central heating or running water. And public activities were mostly reserved for men, such as going to the gymnasium. Extravagance was only for the very wealthy, and it was frowned upon in a democratic society. Women were clearly subordinates. There was an open and companionable relationship with men, but our marriages were arranged, and they were monogamous. Women were married at about the age of 14 to men who were generally in the age range of 30. Women were expected to live about 40 years in this time period. They did not appear with their husbands in sort of public appearances, but they did oversee the running of the home and production of textiles, was extremely important to the economical running of the home itself and society at large. There's much pottery that deals with women being master weavers. And so here in this particular vase, you can see them making yarn, and it goes through the whole process of making textiles. They would make all the textiles for the home, and they were these textiles were highly praised in society, prized in society. Women were allowed to attend tragic plays, but not comedies. They were considered to be too bawdy for the feminine aesthetic. Women were expected to be inconspicuous to the point of invisibility, so they would often wear veils to obscure part of the face and neck. This may have come to Greece from Ionia, or the Near East around 530 BC. And I think that it is thought that veils symbolize the subjugation of women to their husbands specifically. The exception to all of this, well, there's actually two exceptions to all of this. The first being priestesses for female gods. These women came from affluent families of high social rank, and some of them were actually hereditary, so being passed from mother to daughter and so on and so forth. They were held in very high regard, but in specific circumstances. Another exception was prostitutes. So there would be your average variety of prostitute who would generally, there's descriptions of being naked, and that was what was expected. No sort of socially recognizable woman would be ever caught not dressed in the proper way. But prostitutes of all cultures generally have a different standard of dress. But there were also courtesans who played music and danced. These women were called hetairai, and which means companions. So we also see this later in Europe specifically, that these high-class courtesans were highly educated, to the level that they could talk politics and world cultural events with men. They were well read and learned. Some were known for philosophical disputation and literary efforts, and they often dyed their hair blonde to set them apart from the rest of the dark-haired society. This continues specifically in Venice much, much later, and I will be talking a little bit about the Venetian courtesans and one of my favorite movies, which is called Dangerous Beauty. The exception to this in Greece, to the way that women were treated specifically in Greece, was Sparta, where women were less restricted. There was a state of, basically, this was a state of affairs that made other Greeks uncomfortable. Sparta has always sort of done its own thing, and women had a very different relationship with their counterparts in Sparta. Now, it probably wasn't so vastly different that it was, but yeah, women had a higher standing in that culture. So here is your second statue. You can see now that we're moving into contrapposto land. So what contrapposto stance really means is that one side of the body is relaxed and the other one is taut, but opposite arms and legs. So let me say that in a different way. It creates tense and relaxed parts of the body on opposite sides. So in this case, you have the weight of the body resting on this leg, and you have the other leg being more relaxed. Here you have tension in this arm, which is opposite the load-bearing leg. And in here you have this relaxed arm as well. Now, this is made out of marble, which really can't hold itself up in all ways. Now, this will be figured out over time, but you usually need for marble statues to figure out how the statue can exist without breaking apart. And so the sculptor put in a support here for this arm and also has this tree support over here. You can also see how extremely anatomically correct the statue is, lifelike, and it really does heighten that ideal form of manhood. Next, we're going to talk about the Ionic column specifically. So the Ionic column has sort of these two scrolls, or it's often called scrolls, but many people have tried to explain what these spiraling volutes, so that's what they're actually called, is volutes, V-O-L-U-T-E-S. Some say that they depict ram's horns, others that they depict nautilus shells. But in Greece, with the emphasis on arithmetic, most think that it's the Fibonacci sequence, that is a simple arithmetic progression that regulates the balances of natural growth, including the two things that I just listed, the ram's horns and the nautilus shell. Here we have the Ionic order, still the same parts of that we had discussed before. I'm showing you this twice because you will have to know these things. But generally, the Ionic order is the middle level of complexity and size. Generally, Ionic columns are not quite as tall as Corinthian columns, which we're going to cover in the Hellenistic period, but are usually taller than Doric columns. There's also different kinds of bases. Rather than just the simple sitting on a piece of marble that we saw with the Doric. So there's these like multiple different kinds of ways that the column can engage with the ground. The next image that we have is the Temple of Athena, Polias at, I cannot pronounce most of these Greek city names, nor do I think any of you could either. Priene, specifically, we've got the same construction we were talking about before. It's a slightly smaller building, but here we've got the actual Doric columns, and we are now seeing that even in smaller buildings, the columns wrap around the entire building. You can also see on the ground plan here that the front is completely open and you may enter. This is the Erechtheion, also at the Acropolis. It is both a temple to Athena and Poseidon. Parts of it were constructed after other parts of it had been constructed, so it doesn't have a stable ground plan the way the others are. The other thing about it is not only are there Ionic columns, but there are also a kind of column that we haven't discussed yet called the Caryatids. The Egyptians do this as well. These are specifically Greek women, clearly, unlike the ones that we saw that you could see if you were researching Egypt a little bit more. This is a recreation of one of the temples, so you could really see the scale here, how much the scale is getting larger. There's also a tendency throughout Greece, the Greece time period, for the temples to have more and more columns and many more series of colonnades. In dress, we see the Ionic influence as well. So now what we're doing, instead of here in the Doric, wrapping the garment around the body and then pinning it at the shoulders, we now completely pin the garment at the shoulders in multiple decorative places, and then we wrap the garment with some kind of rope around the waist. Here's a recreation of the Ionic chiton. So here on the side, you can see it's a little fuzzy. You can see that there's that split with the fastenings. These would be decorative pins sometimes, or they might be sewn. Here is the himation over top of the chiton. As I discussed earlier, because of the women were meant to feel invisible, the himation may have been wrapped over the head as well, in certain styles also taken from Ionic culture, and there would be different kinds of decorative ways to wear the himation over the body, often diagonally. You can see that the detail on the hems is starting to become more complicated, so we're starting to see more decoration, and the sort of swaddling effect. Men would also wear himation over their bodies still. Just think of it as putting on a coat, but it would be worn in different ways based on gender and status. Here's another representation of the Doric chiton versus the Ionic chiton with the himation. So it's just becoming a little bit more detailed and extravagant. This is the Delphos gown by Fortuny, and so one of the groups is going to cover this. This is from the 1930s. He developed a specific kind of pleating, and that's what you're seeing with this undergarment here. That is called Fortuny pleat specifically, and this is from him looking at different sculptures and seeing the way that the artists would depict draping the fabric as having really, really small pleats. And so he created a way to actually really do that with fabric, and it was very popular. There's actually a paper artist who takes Fortuny garments, research from those garments and recreates them in paper. It's really kind of fascinating. There's a show of that a couple of years ago here in Seattle. And he also would use this idea of himation being draped over the body. Which brings us to the Hellenistic period. So at this point, I'm going to pause and let you watch the Edpuzzle, specifically having to do with Alexander the Great, and anything else that may be on the lesson plan.